November 14, 1944, a Tuesday evening at Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky. In the women's section of the prisoner of war facility, 58 German women stood in the mess hall line, their faces carrying the hollow-eyed exhaustion of months spent retreating across France. They had been captured 3 weeks earlier near the Belgian border. Members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps who had served as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel for the crumbling Wehrmacht. Now they waited for what they assumed would be the meager rations befitting enemy prisoners. What happened next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Before we discover what made these women believe it was Sunday, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 23-year-old Lieselotte Hartmann stood third in line, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the metal tray she had been issued. The former radio operator from Dresden had lost nearly 30 pounds during the final chaotic months of her service. Her gray auxiliary uniform, once fitted, now hung loosely on her frame. She had eaten nothing but watery turnip soup and black bread for the past 4 months. The last time she had seen real meat was in June, at her sister's wedding, when her family had sacrificed an entire month's rations for a small pork roast. Behind her, 27-year-old Hildegard Zimmermann, a nurse from Stuttgart, whispered in German to 21-year-old Irmgard Schaefer. They were trying to guess what the Americans would serve. Potato peelings in water maybe, some kind of grain mush, certainly nothing substantial. They had been taught that America itself was suffering from food shortages, that the capitalist system was collapsing under the weight of war production. The line moved forward, and Liesel found herself standing before Corporal Eugene Miller, a broad-shouldered young man from Iowa who managed the camp kitchen. He wore a genuine smile as he lifted a serving spoon. On her tray he placed a thick slice of meatloaf, its surface glazed and glistening. Beside it, he added a generous mound of mashed potatoes, creating a small crater in the top, which he filled with rich brown gravy. On the other side of the tray, he spooned out green beans glistening with butter. Liesel stared at the tray in her hands, unable to move. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. This was more food than her entire family had eaten in a week back in Dresden. This was the kind of meal reserved for Christmas or Easter. This was Sunday dinner. Behind her, she heard Irmgard gasp. Then, Hannelore Richter, the youngest at 19, spoke the words they were all thinking. "But it's Tuesday," she said in German, her voice breaking. "Why are they giving us Sunday dinner on Tuesday?" The confusion rippled through the line of German women like a physical wave. Several began to cry softly. Others stood frozen, staring at their trays as if the food might disappear if they looked away. 6 months earlier, in May 1944, Liesel Hartmann had stood in a different line. This one stretched down the Pragerstrasse in Dresden, women and elderly men waiting for their weekly rations. She held her family's ration cards tightly, knowing that these precious stamps represented the difference between survival and starvation. The war had transformed her beautiful city into a place of perpetual hunger. Her younger sister, Margaret, had fainted twice that month from malnutrition. Their mother had given up her own portions so the girls could maintain strength for their work assignments. Liesel's position with the Women's Auxiliary Corps guaranteed slightly better rations, but even those had been cut 3 times since the beginning of the year. What they called bread was now more sawdust than flour. The margarine was gray and tasted of chemicals. Real butter had become a distant memory from childhood. Hildegard Zimmermann's experience in Stuttgart had been even worse. As a nurse at the city hospital, she had watched patients die not from their injuries or illnesses, but from simple starvation. The hospital had no food to give them. Children arrived with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. She had held the hand of a 7-year-old boy as he died, not from the pneumonia that had brought him in, but because his body had nothing left to fight with. The ersatz coffee they drank was made from roasted acorns and chicory. It tasted bitter and provided no real nourishment, but the hot liquid gave the illusion of sustenance. Sugar had disappeared entirely by March. The monthly ration of meat had shrunk to 100 grams per person, barely enough for a single small meal. Most families saved it for Sundays, the one day when they could pretend life was still normal. Traudi Becker, the 25-year-old communications specialist from Berlin, remembered her last real meal in Germany. It was her mother's birthday in April, and the family had pooled their rations for 2 weeks to create something resembling a celebration. They had made potato pancakes with one precious egg divided among 8 people. There had been no oil for frying, so they used water in the pan. Her mother had cried when they sang to her, not from happiness, but from grief at what their lives had become. The women had been taught that their sacrifices were necessary for victory. The propaganda films showed them that Americans were suffering equally, that the entire world was starving because of British blockades. They were told that enemy prisoners in American camps were treated brutally, given barely enough food to survive, worked to exhaustion as punishment for their nation's aggression. Irmgard Schaefer, the young clerk from Munich, had believed every word. She had volunteered for auxiliary service, believing she was protecting her homeland from enemies who wanted to starve them into submission. Now, standing in a Kentucky mess hall with more food on her tray than she had seen in months, every belief she held about America was crumbling. The transport ship had departed from Le Havre on October 23, 1944. 58 German women, guarded by American military police, had crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a converted cargo vessel. They had expected the worst. Stories circulated among them during the voyage of prison camps where captured Germans were beaten, starved, and forced into slave labor. These stories had been reinforced by years of propaganda showing American soldiers as barbaric criminals. Liesel had spent the 11-day crossing convinced she was sailing toward her death. She had written final letters to her family, which she kept hidden in her uniform pocket. She memorized her sister's face from the small photograph she carried, certain she would never see Margaret again. The other women shared similar fears. They comforted each other in whispered German conversations, trying to maintain dignity in the face of what they believed would be their destruction. When they arrived at Camp Breckinridge in western Kentucky, they were met by Captain Dorothy Brennan, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee prisoner facilities. Captain Brennan was a 34-year-old career military officer from Boston who had specifically requested this assignment. She had studied German in college and understood that these women were not hardened Nazi soldiers, but auxiliary personnel caught in circumstances beyond their control. The camp itself surprised them. It was clean, organized, and far less threatening than they had imagined. The barracks designated for female prisoners were simple but weatherproof, with real beds and blankets. There were washing facilities with running water. The fences were there, certainly, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter, but there was none of the brutality they had been taught to expect. Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, a Polish-American from Chicago, had processed their arrival with mechanical efficiency, but without cruelty. He had explained the camp rules in slow, clear English, while Elfriede Wagner, who spoke some English from her school days, translated for the others. They would have work assignments. They would follow a daily schedule. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention standards for prisoners of war. What he did not mention, what none of them could have anticipated, was Corporal Eugene Miller's philosophy about food. The young Iowan had grown up on a farm where meals were abundant and hospitality was sacred. He had carried those values into military service, believing that how you fed people revealed your character. When he had been assigned to manage the camp kitchen, he had made a private decision that would change everything. He would feed the German prisoners exactly the same food he would serve to American soldiers, not because regulations required it, but because his conscience demanded it. The mess hall fell silent as the 58 women found seats at the long tables. They placed their trays down carefully, as if the food might vanish if handled roughly. Liesel sat between Hilda and Irmgard, all three staring at their plates with expressions that mixed disbelief with something approaching fear. Around them, American guards and camp personnel ate the same meal, treating it as completely ordinary. Corporal Miller moved through the room, checking that everyone had been served. He noticed the German women's reactions, but misunderstood their stillness as hesitation about unfamiliar food. "It's just meatloaf," he said cheerfully to the table where Liesel sat, though none of them understood his English. "My ma's recipe. Nothing fancy, but it sticks to your ribs." 19-year-old Hannelore Richter was the first to pick up her fork. Her hands shook as she cut into the meatloaf, watching the way it held together, the way the glaze caught the overhead lights. She brought a small piece to her mouth and closed her eyes as she chewed. The taste of real meat, seasoned with herbs she could not identify, was so overwhelming that tears began streaming down her face. The crying spread like a contagion through the tables. Trouty Becker sobbed quietly as she ate her mashed potatoes, each bite a revelation of butter and cream. Irmgard could not stop staring at the green beans, touching them with her fork to confirm they were real. 31-year-old Elfriede Wagner, the eldest and most composed of the group, found herself weeping into her napkin as she tasted food that reminded her of life before the war. The American personnel exchanged uncomfortable glances. Private Raymond Chen, the guard of Chinese descent who had been assigned to watch the women's section, approached Sergeant Kowalski with concern. "Sir, something's wrong. They're all crying. Should we call the medical officer?" Sergeant Kowalski watched the scene with growing understanding. He had heard stories from his parents about hunger in Poland, about what it meant to go months without adequate food. He recognized what he was seeing. These were not tears of distress. These were tears of shock at abundance after prolonged deprivation. Captain Brennan observed from her position near the door. She had read the intelligence reports about conditions in Germany, about the severe rationing and food shortages. But reading reports and witnessing the visceral reaction to a simple Tuesday dinner were entirely different things. She made a mental note to request medical evaluations for all the prisoners, suspecting that malnutrition was far worse than their initial assessments had indicated. Liesel forced herself to eat slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to devour everything on her tray immediately. She had seen what happened when starving people ate too quickly after prolonged deprivation. She took small bites, chewing, carefully, letting her body adjust to the richness of the food. The third day at Camp Breckenridge brought breakfast, and with it, a new crisis of conscience. Liesel sat in the mess hall staring at scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, and a cup of real coffee. She had not seen this much food at one time since before the war began. Her stomach, which had shrunk during months of near starvation, could barely hold a full meal. Yet here was another feast, presented as if it were nothing remarkable. Trouty Becker pushed her eggs around her plate, unable to take a bite. The 25-year-old from Berlin had received a Red Cross letter the day before. Her mother's careful handwriting described how they were surviving on potato peels and cabbage leaves. Her younger brother, only 14, had been conscripted into the Volkssturm and sent to defend what remained of Germany's eastern territories. The family was eating one meal every 2 days, stretching their rations to breaking point. Now Trouty sat before more food than her entire family would see in a week, and the weight of that abundance felt like a betrayal. She was eating bacon while her mother boiled leather scraps to make something resembling soup. She was spreading real butter on white bread while her brother, if he was still alive, marched toward certain death on an empty stomach. Hilda Zimmerman noticed Trouty's untouched plate and understood immediately. The nurse from Stuttgart had been wrestling with the same guilt since that first Tuesday dinner. She leaned close and whispered in German, "Not eating will not feed your family. It only wastes what has been given." But the logic of survival did not ease the emotional burden. Around the table, other women struggled with similar conflicts. Irmgard had stopped writing in her diary because she could not bear to record the truth of her circumstances. How could she write that she was eating 3 full meals daily while Germany starved? How could she describe the thickness of the gravy, the tenderness of the meat, without feeling like she was documenting her own treason? 31-year-old Elfriede Wagner had taken a different approach. She ate everything placed before her with methodical determination. When the younger women expressed their guilt, she told them bluntly that their suffering would not alleviate anyone else's hunger. Their deaths from refusing food would not save a single German child. They had a duty, she argued, to survive, to bear witness, to eventually return home and rebuild what the war had destroyed. Yet even Elfriede's practical philosophy could not entirely silence the voice that whispered she was collaborating with the enemy simply by accepting their food. The propaganda they had been fed for years had taught them that accepting anything from Americans was a form of moral surrender. Every bite felt like an admission that everything they had believed about their enemies might be wrong. Private Raymond Chen, observing from his post, noticed that many of the women ate with their heads bowed, as if in shame. Captain Brennan documented these observations in her daily reports, noting severe psychological distress related to the disparity between their treatment and conditions in their homeland. On the 5th evening at Camp Breckenridge, after another substantial dinner of pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the German women gathered in their barracks for what had become an unspoken ritual. They sat on their bunks in the fading November light and talked about food. Not the abundant American meals they were now eating, but the meals they remembered from home, from the time before hunger became their constant companion. Elfriede Wagner spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience. She described her mother's Sunday sauerbraten, a dish that required days of preparation. The beef would marinate for nearly a week in a mixture of vinegar, wine, and spices. Her mother would turn it twice daily, talking to it as if the meat could hear her patience and care. On Sunday morning, she would begin the slow roasting process that filled their Stuttgart apartment with smells that made neighbors stop in the hallway. The sauerbraten was served with red cabbage, cooked with apples and caraway seeds, and potato dumplings so light they seemed to float in the rich gravy. Elfriede's father would carve the roast at the table, a ceremony that marked Sunday as different from every other day. Her brothers would argue about who got the end pieces. Her mother would pretend to scold them while hiding her smile. 19-year-old Hannelore Richter wiped her eyes as she shared her own Sunday memory. Her mother in Bremen made apple strudel that was famous throughout their neighborhood. The dough had to be stretched so thin you could read newspaper through it, a skill that took her mother years to master. Hannelore had been learning the technique before the war, standing beside her mother at the kitchen table, trying to coax the dough to transparency without tearing it. The filling was apples mixed with raisins, cinnamon, and just enough sugar to bring out the fruit's sweetness. Her mother would brush each layer with melted butter before rolling it into its characteristic spiral. When it came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, it would sit cooling on the windowsill while the family returned from church. Liesel Hartmann's Sunday memory centered on her grandmother's chicken soup. Not the watery broths they had choked down during the war years, but real soup made from a whole chicken that had lived in their courtyard until Saturday evening. Her grandmother would simmer it for hours with carrots, celery, onions, and fresh dill from the garden. The apartment would fill with steam and comfort. Her grandmother insisted that good soup required patience and love in equal measure. You could not rush the broth. The vegetables needed time to soften and surrender their flavors. When the soup was finally ready, her grandmother would strain it twice, then add thin egg noodles that she had rolled and cut that morning. Hilda Zimmerman described her family's tradition of Sunday breakfast, which seemed impossibly luxurious now. Fresh bread rolls from the baker, still warm when her father brought them home. Real butter, yellow and soft, sliced meats and cheeses arranged on her mother's good platter, soft-boiled eggs in porcelain cups, strong coffee with real cream and sugar. The memories flowed around the barracks like a shared liturgy of loss. Each woman contributed her family's Sunday rituals, the foods that had marked their weeks and defined their identities. Corporal Eugene Miller had grown up on a 200-acre farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the youngest of 6 children in a family where food was both sustenance and love language. His mother, Ruth Miller, had fed not only her own large family but also every hired hand, traveling salesman, and neighbor who happened to arrive at mealtime. In the Miller household, no one left the table hungry. It was a point of pride and a moral principle. Eugene had enlisted in 1942, shortly after his 20th birthday, expecting to see combat in Europe or the Pacific. Instead, the Army had noted his farm background and assigned him to quartermaster duties. When he protested that he wanted to fight, his commanding officer had told him something he initially dismissed as bureaucratic nonsense, but later came to understand as profound truth. Son, an Army marches on its stomach. Feeding soldiers properly is combat support. By the time he was transferred to Camp Breckenridge in October 1944, Eugene had developed a philosophy about food that went beyond simple nutrition. He believed that how you fed people revealed your character and values. If you fed them poorly, with contempt or indifference, you told them they had no worth. If you fed them well, with care and attention, you acknowledged their humanity regardless of circumstances. When he learned he would be managing the kitchen for a prisoner of war camp, Eugene made a decision that he never bothered to run past his superiors. He would serve the German prisoners exactly the same food he served to American personnel. Not because regulations required it, though the Geneva Convention did mandate adequate nutrition for prisoners. He did it because his mother had raised him to believe that food was a sacred trust, and that trust did not disappear just because someone spoke a different language or wore a different uniform. Sergeant Kowalski had questioned this approach during Eugene's first week at the camp. "You know they're Nazis, right? These aren't innocent civilians. They served Hitler's military." Eugene had considered this while chopping onions for that evening's beef stew. "Sergeant, I've been reading the reports about what we're finding in Germany, the concentration camps, the starvation, all of it. You know what I think separates us from them? We don't become monsters just because we're fighting monsters. If I start treating prisoners like they're subhuman, if I start feeding them slop because I think they deserve it, then I'm no different than the enemy we're supposed to be better than." The sergeant had not argued further, though Eugene suspected his reasoning had been forwarded up the chain of command. No one stopped him, so he continued cooking the way his mother had taught him. He made meatloaf with her recipe, mixing ground beef with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and a special blend of spices. He mashed potatoes with real butter and cream. He made gravy from pan drippings the way it was supposed to be made. He noticed everything about how the German women responded to the food. Their tears at that first meal had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Their careful, almost fearful way of eating suggested deprivation he could barely imagine. He began adjusting portions, watching for signs of malnutrition, reporting his observations to Captain Brennan. Week 2 at Camp Breckenridge brought an incident that Captain Brennan would later describe in her reports as a complete breakdown of emotional control among the prisoners. It began with something absurdly simple: butter. Real butter, yellow and creamy, placed in small dishes on each table during breakfast service. Not margarine, not the gray artificial substitute they had known in Germany, but actual butter made from cream. Corporal Miller had ordered it specially, noticing that the margarine they had been using was barely better than what he imagined the women had experienced in Germany. He wanted them to taste something genuinely good, something that reminded them of better times. He had no idea he was about to trigger a crisis. Hilda Zimmerman was the first to break. The 27-year-old nurse from Stuttgart reached for the butter dish, spread a small amount on her toast, and took a single bite. Then she put down the toast, placed her face in her hands, and began sobbing with such intensity that her entire body shook. The sound was raw and terrible, emerging from somewhere deep in her chest. Within moments, the crying spread through the mess hall like wildfire. Irmgard collapsed forward onto the table, her shoulders heaving. Hannelore wrapped her arms around herself and rocked back and forth, tears streaming down her face. Even stoic Elfriede Wagner had to excuse herself from the table, her composure finally shattered by the taste of real butter on warm bread. Liesel sat frozen, the butter melting on her toast, watching her fellow prisoners fall apart around her. She understood exactly what was happening. The butter had unlocked something in all of them, some final barrier between the suffering they had endured and the abundance they were now experiencing. It was not just butter. It was every Sunday morning before the war. It was childhood and normalcy and a world that no longer existed. The American personnel stood helpless, unsure how to respond to this collective emotional collapse. Sergeant Kowalski made a move to intervene, but Captain Brennan stopped him with a raised hand. "Let them cry," she said quietly. "They need to." Corporal Miller stood in the kitchen doorway, horrified. He had wanted to give them something good, something comforting. Instead, he had apparently caused mass hysteria. Private Chen approached him carefully. "It's not your fault, Corporal. I don't think they're crying because they're upset. I think they're crying because they're overwhelmed." Hilda's sobs eventually subsided enough for her to speak. In broken English, she tried to explain to Captain Brennan what the butter meant. She described the hospital in Stuttgart where she had worked, the children dying of malnutrition, the mothers who could not produce milk to feed their infants because they themselves were starving. She described watching a 6-year-old girl die because her body had consumed all its fat reserves and begun breaking down muscle tissue. "Butter," Hilda whispered, switching back to German as Elfriede translated. "We dreamed about butter. We told stories about butter like it was gold. My colleague traded her wedding ring for 50 grams of butter to give to a dying patient, hoping it might give him strength to survive. It did not work." She looked down at the butter dish on the table, perhaps 200 grams total, sitting there as if it were nothing special. In Stuttgart, that amount of butter represented months of rations for an entire family. By the third week at Camp Breckenridge, most of the German women had begun writing letters home. The International Red Cross facilitated correspondence between prisoners of war and their families, though the process was slow and unreliable. Letters took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Many women wrote anyway, needing to maintain some connection to the lives they had left behind. Liesel sat on her bunk one evening with paper and pencil, trying to compose a letter to her sister Margaret in Dresden. She had started and abandoned 4 different drafts, unable to find words that felt honest without being cruel. How could she describe her current circumstances without sounding like she was boasting about her good fortune while her family starved? "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "I am safe and well. The Americans treat us according to the Geneva Convention. I hope this letter finds you and Mother healthy. Please write when you can. Your loving sister, Liesel." It was bland, revealing nothing of substance. She read it over and felt disgusted with her own cowardice. This was not communication. This was evasion. She crumpled the paper and started again. "Dear Margaret, I need to tell you the truth about where I am and what I am experiencing. The Americans feed us 3 meals every day. Real meals with meat and vegetables and butter. This morning, I ate scrambled eggs and bacon. Yesterday we had pot roast. Tomorrow, they say, we will have fried chicken. I am gaining weight. My uniform no longer hangs loosely. I can feel my strength returning." She stared at what she had written, imagining Margaret reading these words while surviving on turnip soup and black bread. She imagined her mother's face, thin with hunger, learning that her daughter was eating fried chicken in an enemy prison camp. The image was unbearable. Liesel continued writing, knowing she would never send this letter, but unable to stop. I feel like a traitor every time I eat. I feel like I'm betraying you and Mother and everyone suffering in Germany. The Americans do not torture us or starve us or treat us cruelly. Everything we were told about them was a lie. They show us kindness, and I do not know what to do with that kindness, except feel ashamed of it. Around the barracks, other women were engaged in similar struggles. Trouty wrote pages to her mother describing the camp, the food, the American guards who treated them with unexpected decency. Then she burned the pages in the small stove used to heat the barracks, watching her words turn to ash. Irmgard composed a long letter to her father explaining how confused she felt, how the reality of American captivity contradicted everything she had been taught. She described Corporal Miller's kindness, Captain Brennan's fairness, the way the guards treated them like human beings rather than enemies. She sealed the letter, addressed it, and then tore it into pieces. Only Hannelore actually sent her letters home, but she carefully edited every word to remove any mention of food beyond adequate rations. She wrote about the weather, about her health, about hoping the war would end soon. Her letters were empty of real content, offering her family nothing but the confirmation that she was alive. The fourth week brought a mandatory educational session that Captain Brennan had organized, though she framed it as voluntary language instruction. The women gathered in a recreation room where Sergeant Kowalski had set up a projector and screen. He explained in simple English, with Elfrida translating, that they would be watching American newsreels to help them learn the language and understand American culture. What they actually saw was footage of American life that completely contradicted everything they had been taught. The newsreels showed grocery stores with shelves stocked full of food. They showed families sitting down to elaborate meals. They showed children drinking milk and eating fresh fruit. They showed abundance that seemed almost obscene in its excess. Liesel watched in stunned silence as the screen showed an American housewife shopping for her family's weekly groceries. The woman casually selected items from overflowing displays: fresh meat, vegetables, canned goods, bread, butter, eggs, milk. She filled her cart without hesitation, without ration cards, without the careful calculations that had dominated German shopping for years. The ease of it was shocking. "This is propaganda," Irmgard whispered in German. "They are showing us fake footage to demoralize us." But Elfrida shook her head slowly. "Look at the quality of the film. Look at the details. This is not staged. This is real." The next newsreel showed an American farm family sitting down to Sunday dinner. The table was covered with food: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, butter, gravy, pie for dessert. The family said grace and began eating, talking, and laughing together. It was an ordinary American Sunday, presented as nothing special. Trouty felt something crack inside her chest. For years, she had believed that Americans were suffering just as Germans suffered, that the entire world was locked in a mutual struggle for survival. The propaganda films she had seen showed American breadlines, American families struggling with rationing, American children going hungry. But here was evidence that those films had been lies. The women had been eating American food for 3 weeks now. They had experienced firsthand the abundance that Corporal Miller served from his kitchen. But somehow, seeing it on film, seeing ordinary American families taking such plenty for granted, made the reality undeniable in a new way. After the newsreels ended, Captain Brennan addressed them through Elfrida's translation. "I know what you were told about America. I know you were taught that we were your enemies, that we were cruel and starving just like everyone else. But you can see now that those were lies. America has not been invaded. Our cities have not been bombed. Our people have not starved. We have been fortunate in this war in ways that Europe has not." She paused, letting Elfrida catch up with the translation. "I show you this not to make you feel worse about your circumstances, but to help you understand why we can afford to feed you well. and to show you that everything your government told you about us was designed to maintain your loyalty through fear and misinformation. November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving Day arrived at Camp Breckenridge with an announcement that sent ripples of confusion through the German prisoners. Captain Brennan explained through Elfrida's translation that this was a special American holiday, a day of gratitude and feasting. The women would be served a traditional Thanksgiving meal, the same meal that every American family across the country would be eating. Liesel had no context for understanding what this meant. She knew nothing of pilgrims or harvest celebrations or American traditions. She only understood that something unusual was happening when Corporal Miller and his kitchen staff began preparing food on a scale she had not yet witnessed at the camp. The mess hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves that some of the American guards had made. Tables were covered with cloth instead of being left bare. There was an atmosphere of celebration that felt strange and almost inappropriate to the German women, who could not understand why their captors were making such effort for enemy prisoners. When the food began arriving at the tables, the women fell silent in collective shock. Corporal Miller had prepared everything from scratch, following his mother's recipes and traditions. Each table received a platter with sliced roasted turkey, the meat tender and juicy. Beside it came bowls of mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes with brown sugar and butter, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, stuffing seasoned with sage and onions, and fresh baked rolls still warm from the oven. Dessert would be pumpkin pie with whipped cream, though the women did not yet know this as they stared at the savory feast before them. Hannelore counted the dishes on her table, 7 different foods plus bread and butter. More variety in one meal than her family in Bremen had seen in an entire month. Elfrida stood slowly and addressed Captain Brennan in careful English. "Captain, we do not understand. Why do you do this for us? We are your enemies. We serve the military that has killed American soldiers. Why do you feast us like honored guests?" Captain Brennan had anticipated this question. She had thought carefully about her answer. In America, Thanksgiving is about gratitude and abundance. We give thanks for what we have, and we share that abundance with everyone at our table. Today, you are at our table. That makes you part of our tradition, regardless of the uniforms you once wore. The explanation satisfied no one completely, but the women began to eat because refusing such food felt impossible. Trouty tasted the turkey and found it unlike anything she remembered from Germany. The meat was moist and flavorful, seasoned with herbs that were unfamiliar but delicious. The cranberry sauce was sweet and tart simultaneously. The stuffing absorbed the turkey's juices and melted on her tongue. Hilda tried the sweet potatoes and experienced something close to confusion. She had never eaten potatoes prepared this way, topped with something sweet and rich. It seemed wrong somehow, yet tasted extraordinary. She took another bite, then another, unable to stop despite her bewilderment. Irmgard focused on the mashed potatoes because they were familiar, or should have been, but these were nothing like the potatoes she knew from Germany. These were impossibly smooth and creamy, rich with butter and what she suspected was real cream. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Elfrida Wagner approached Captain Brennan with an unusual request. She wanted to work in the kitchen, not as punishment duty or forced labor, but as a genuine volunteer assignment. She wanted to learn how Corporal Miller created the meals that had so thoroughly disrupted everything she thought she knew about American cooking. Captain Brennan was skeptical. "You understand that kitchen work is hard labor? It's not a privilege assignment." Elfriede smiled grimly. "Captain, I am 31 years old. I have worked hard my entire adult life. I am not afraid of labor. I am afraid of remaining ignorant about how Americans turn simple ingredients into meals that taste like this." After consultation with Corporal Miller, who was intrigued by the request, permission was granted. Elfrida began reporting to the kitchen at 5 o'clock each morning, working alongside the American cooks and learning techniques that astonished her. The first revelation came from watching how much butter Corporal Miller used. He added butter to everything: vegetables, potatoes, bread, sauces. He used it with a casualness that would have been criminal in Germany, where 50 grams of butter was a week's ration for an entire family. Here, he measured butter in cups, not grams. "Corporal," Elfrida asked in her improving English, "why so much butter? Is it not expensive?" Eugene Miller looked at her with genuine confusion. "Expensive? I guess it's not cheap, but butter makes everything taste better. Why would you skimp on something that improves the food?" The question revealed a fundamental difference in worldviews. In Germany, you skimped on everything because scarcity demanded it. In America, at least in Corporal Miller's kitchen, abundance was assumed. You used what you needed to make food taste good, not the minimum required to keep people alive. Elfrida learned that his meatloaf recipe called for ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, milk, onions, and spices, then topped with a ketchup glaze. The concept of glazing meat with tomato sauce seemed bizarre, but she watched how it caramelized during baking, creating a sweet and savory crust that made the whole dish remarkable. She learned that his mashed potatoes required boiling the potatoes until they were completely tender, then mashing them with butter, hot milk, salt, and pepper. The ratio was shocking, nearly equal parts potato and dairy. In Germany, such a recipe would have been considered wasteful to the point of immorality. She learned that his gravy was made from pan drippings, flour, and stock, simmered until it thickened to the right consistency. He tasted it constantly, adjusting seasonings, adding more salt or pepper until it was exactly right. The attention to flavor, rather than just nutrition, was a revelation. Other women began requesting kitchen assignments, wanting to learn what Elfriede was learning. Soon, Hannelore was helping with breakfast preparation, Irmgard was assisting with baking, and even quiet Liesel found herself learning to make the yeast rolls that appeared at dinner. Corporal Miller discovered he enjoyed teaching. He showed them how to test bread dough for proper rising, how to tell when meat was cooked through, how to make simple sauces that elevated plain vegetables into something special. By mid-December, the physical transformation of the German prisoners had become impossible to ignore. The camp medical officer, Dr. Richard Hayes, conducted monthly health assessments and documented changes that he described in his reports as remarkable and somewhat unprecedented. Liesel had gained 17 pounds since her arrival in early November. Her face had filled out, losing the hollow-cheeked appearance of malnutrition. Her hair, which had been brittle and dull, now showed signs of health and shine. Her skin, previously gray with poor nutrition, had regained color. Most significantly, her energy levels had improved dramatically. She no longer felt the constant exhaustion that had plagued her final months in Germany. Hilda had gained 21 pounds, the most of any prisoner. Dr. Hayes noted that she had likely been suffering from severe protein deficiency when she arrived. Her body was rebuilding muscle mass that had been cannibalized during months of inadequate food. She could now work full shifts in the medical facility without needing rest breaks. Hannelore, the youngest at 19, had grown noticeably in height as well as weight. Dr. Hayes theorized that her growth had been stunted by wartime malnutrition and was now resuming a more normal pattern. She had gained 15 pounds and nearly 2 inches in height, her body finally receiving the nutrients it needed for development. The physical changes were obvious and measurable. The psychological changes were more subtle but equally significant. Sergeant Kowalski noted in his security reports that the prisoners' demeanor had shifted. They no longer moved with the defeated posture of captured enemies. They walked with better bearing, made eye contact more readily, and seemed less fearful of the guards and staff. Private Chen observed that the women smiled now, something he had not seen during their first weeks at the camp. They laughed during meals, made jokes in German that he could not understand but could recognize as humor by their tone and expressions. They seemed, despite being prisoners of war, more alive than when they arrived. But the weight they carried was not only physical. Captain Brennan's counseling sessions, which she conducted informally during evening recreation hours, revealed the emotional burden of recovery. The women struggled with what Liesl called the weight of kindness, the psychological difficulty of accepting care from people they had been taught to hate. Trouty expressed it most clearly during one session. "Every pound I gain feels like a pound of guilt. My body is healing, but my conscience is sick. How do I reconcile being healthy while my family starves? How do I accept that Americans have shown me more humanity than my own government ever did?" These questions had no easy answers, and Captain Brennan did not pretend otherwise. She could only assure them that accepting kindness was not betrayal, that surviving was not collaboration, and that healing their bodies was the first step toward eventually healing the larger wounds that war had created. December brought the first substantial wave of Red Cross letters from Germany, and with them, a devastating contrast that made the women's guilt unbearable. The letters had been written in October and early November, taking nearly 2 months to arrive through the circuitous routing required by wartime mail systems. They described a Germany that was collapsing into chaos and starvation. Hannelore received a letter from her mother in Bremen. The handwriting was shaky, reflecting either emotion or physical weakness, possibly both. Her mother described how their neighborhood had been bombed 3 times in October. Their building still stood, but many neighbors were now homeless. The ration cards had been cut again. They were now receiving 100 grams of bread per day, no meat, no butter, no eggs. Her younger sister had stopped menstruating, a common sign of severe malnutrition in young women. The letter continued with news that Hannelore's father, who worked in a munitions factory, had collapsed at work from exhaustion and hunger. He had recovered, but was noticeably weaker. Her mother tried to maintain an optimistic tone, assuring Hannelore that they were managing, that they were strong, that they would survive until the war ended. But the desperation leaked through every carefully composed sentence. Hannelore sat on her bunk holding this letter, having just returned from lunch, where she had eaten beef stew with fresh bread and butter. She had eaten until she was completely full, even taking a second serving. Now she read about her father collapsing from hunger and felt physically sick with guilt. Trouty's letter from her mother in Berlin was even more harrowing. The city was under constant bombing. They spent most nights in cellars and subway tunnels. Food was nearly non-existent. Her mother described boiling potato peelings 3 times to extract any remaining nutrition. She described neighbors dying, not from bombs but from starvation and disease brought on by weakened immune systems. The most devastating part of Trouty's letter was the news about her 14-year-old brother. He had been sent to the Eastern Front with the Volkssturm, the desperate last-minute militia of old men and boys that Germany was throwing against the advancing Soviet forces. Her mother had received no word from him in 3 weeks. She was trying to maintain hope but preparing herself for the worst. Trouty folded the letter carefully and placed it in her footlocker. Then she walked to the latrine and vomited up her lunch, unable to keep food down while processing the news of her brother's likely death. Liesel's letter from her sister Margaret was brief and factual, which somehow made it worse. Dresden was surviving, though barely. Their mother was ill with pneumonia but could not get adequate medical care because the hospitals were overwhelmed. They had no medicine, no proper food to build strength. Margaret worked 12-hour shifts at a factory making uniforms. She was exhausted and hungry all the time. The letter ended with a single line that broke Liesel's heart. "I dream about food every night. I wake up and my stomach hurts from the emptiness." Liesl had just dreamed about home the previous night. In her dream, she was back in Dresden, trying to share her American meals with her family. But every time she handed them food, it disappeared. She woke up feeling helpless and ashamed. The letters from home created a crisis within the barracks that threatened to undo months of physical and psychological recovery. Several women stopped eating. unable to reconcile their full plates with their family's starvation. Hannelore lost 5 pounds in 1 week. Trouty ate only the minimum required to avoid punishment. Even Elfrida, usually so pragmatic, found herself pushing food around her plate without appetite. Captain Brennan recognized the crisis and called a mandatory evening assembly. The 58 women gathered in the recreation hall, many carrying letters from home, all bearing visible signs of renewed emotional trauma. Captain Brennan stood before them with Elfrida translating, knowing that what she said next would either help them through this crisis or deepen their despair. "I know many of you received letters this week," she began. "I know those letters contained devastating news about conditions in Germany. I know you are struggling with guilt about your circumstances here compared to your family's suffering at home." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I cannot tell you not to feel guilty. Guilt is a natural response to survival when others are suffering. But I can tell you that destroying your own health will not save anyone in Germany. Refusing to eat will not put food on your family's tables. Making yourselves sick will not make them well." Trouty stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. In halting English, she responded directly, "You say this because you do not understand. You are American. You have never been hungry. You do not know what it means to eat while your family starves." Captain Brennan did not flinch from the accusation. "You are right. I have never experienced what you are experiencing, but I understand mathematics, and the mathematics of your situation are clear. You are prisoners of war. You have no control over your circumstances. You cannot send food home. You cannot end the war. You cannot change the decisions that led to your family's suffering." She softened her tone. "What you can control is whether you survive this war healthy enough to help rebuild when it ends. Your families need you to survive. They need you to be strong and healthy so that when this is over, you can return and help them recover. Every meal you refuse is a betrayal of their hope that you will come home whole." The words hit hard because they contained truth that the women had been avoiding. Hilda stood next, her nurse's training informing her perspective. "The captain is correct. About the medical facts, we were all suffering from malnutrition when we arrived. Some of us were close to organ failure. If we had continued in those conditions much longer, we would have died. The question is not whether we deserve to eat. The question is whether we choose to live." Liesel found her voice, speaking in German, with Elfrida translating. "But how do we live with this? How do we sit down to meat and potatoes knowing our families are eating potato peelings? How do we gain weight while they waste away?" May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was finally over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich had collapsed. The fighting had stopped. But for the 58 German women at Camp Breckenridge, the end of the war brought not relief but profound uncertainty about what came next. Captain Brennan called a general assembly to announce the official news and explain what it meant for the prisoners. The women gathered in the mess hall with mixed emotions visible on their faces. Relief that the killing had stopped, fear about what they would find if they returned home, confusion about their own futures. "Ladies," Captain Brennan began, waiting for Elfrida to translate. "The war in Europe has ended. Germany has surrendered. You are no longer soldiers of an active military force. Under the Geneva Convention, you will be repatriated to Germany as soon as transportation can be arranged." The word repatriation hung in the air. It meant going home, but home to what? The letters they had received over the past months painted a picture of devastation, cities in ruins, families scattered or dead, a country occupied by foreign armies and struggling with starvation, worse than anything they had experienced before capture. Liesel thought about Dresden, wondering if her family's apartment building still stood. Allied bombing had intensified in the final months of the war. She had no recent letters, no way of knowing if her mother and sister had survived. The thought of returning to search through rubble for her family was paralyzing. Hilda thought about Stuttgart and her hospital, both likely destroyed. Even if the building stood, there would be no medical supplies, no food for patients, no functioning infrastructure. She would return to nurse dying patients with no resources to help them, just as she had done before her capture. Trouty had received confirmation 3 weeks earlier that her 14-year-old brother was dead, killed on the Eastern Front. Her mother's letter had been brief and devastated. Returning to Berlin meant facing her mother's grief with nothing to offer but her presence. It meant living in a city divided among occupying powers, struggling for survival in the ruins of Hitler's capital. Captain Brennan continued, sensing their turmoil. "I understand this news is complicated for you. The Army will provide transportation to displaced persons, camps in Europe. From there, you will be processed and released to return to your homes. The timeline is uncertain, but likely within the next 2 to 3 months. 2 to 3 more months of American meals, American warmth, American safety. Then back to Germany and whatever remained of their former lives." The math was simple, but the emotions were impossibly complex. That evening, the women gathered in their barracks for a discussion that lasted until after midnight. They spoke in rapid German, their voices rising and falling with emotion as they debated what returning home meant and whether they had any alternative. Elfriede raised the question that several had been thinking, but none had dared to speak. What if we asked to stay? The suggestion was met with shocked silence. Prisoners of war asking to remain with their captors rather than accept freedom? It seemed absurd, possibly even treasonous. But as they talked through the night, the idea began to seem less impossible and more like a desperate but rational response to circumstances none of them had chosen. May 20th, 1945. 12 days after VE Day, Corporal Eugene Miller made an announcement that surprised everyone at Camp Breckenridge. He was organizing a special Sunday dinner for the German prisoners before repatriation proceedings began in earnest. Not just any Sunday dinner, but the kind of elaborate feast his mother would have prepared for important family occasions back in Cedar Rapids. The women understood the significance immediately. This would be their last meal together at the camp, their final experience of the abundance that had so thoroughly disrupted their understanding of America and themselves. Corporal Miller had been planning it for days, requisitioning special ingredients and recruiting extra kitchen help. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and warm weather. The mess hall had been decorated more elaborately than even Thanksgiving. Corporal Miller had somehow acquired fresh flowers for the tables. White tablecloths covered the usual bare surfaces. The American guards helped arrange chairs and place settings with unusual care. The meal itself was extraordinary. Corporal Miller had prepared roasted chicken with herb stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, glazed carrots, fresh green beans with almonds, homemade dinner rolls with butter, and a mixed salad with vegetables he had sourced from local farms. For dessert, there would be apple pie with vanilla ice cream, a treat the women had never experienced. But before the food was served, Corporal Miller did something unprecedented. He stood before the gathered prisoners and spoke directly to them, with Elfriede translating his words carefully. "Ladies, when you first arrived here 6 months ago, I made a decision. I decided I would feed you the same way I would feed my own family, not because rules required it, but because I believe that how we treat people, especially people we have power over, defines who we are as individuals and as a nation." He paused, visibly emotional. "You have taught me something important. You have shown me that people can change, that enemies can become friends, and that food shared in good faith can bridge divides that weapons never could. When you leave here and return to Germany, I want you to remember that America fed you not because we had to, but because we chose to. I hope you will carry that memory forward as you rebuild your lives and your country." The meal that followed was eaten slowly, with full awareness that this particular experience was ending. Liesel tasted everything carefully, trying to memorize flavors she might never experience again. Hannelore ate her apple pie with tears streaming down her face, knowing that her mother in Bremen would never believe such abundance existed. Trouty saved a dinner roll in her pocket, wrapping it carefully in a napkin. She knew it would go stale, that she could not preserve it forever, but she needed some tangible reminder of these months when enemies had shown her more humanity than her own leaders ever had. Hilda sat next to Irmgard, and they held hands under the table while eating with their free hands. They had become sisters through shared experience, bound together by confusion, guilt, transformation, and the strange grace of American kindness that had saved their lives while complicating their consciences. As the meal concluded, Elfrida stood to speak on behalf of all the prisoners. Her English had become fluent over the months, and she addressed Corporal Miller and Captain Brennan directly. 25 years later, in May 1970, Lieselotte Hartmann Fischer stood in the kitchen of her home in Frankfurt, teaching her teenage daughter how to make American-style meatloaf. The recipe was written on a yellowed index card in her own handwriting, copied carefully from memory of watching Corporal Eugene Miller prepare it at Camp Breckenridge a quarter century earlier. Her daughter, Anna, who had been born in 1952, had heard versions of her mother's story throughout her childhood, but had never fully understood what it meant. Now, as Liesel mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs, eggs, and spices, she tried once more to explain. When I was captured in 1944, I believed Americans were our enemies. I had been taught they were cruel, that they would torture prisoners, that they were barely surviving themselves. Everything I believed was wrong. She shaped the meatloaf mixture into a pan, her hands moving with practiced confidence. The first meal they gave us was meatloaf like this. It was a Tuesday evening, but the food was so abundant we thought it must be Sunday. We could not understand why they would give us Sunday dinner on a weekday. Anna watched her mother work, seeing the distant look in her eyes that always appeared when she spoke of those days. But you came home. You could have stayed in America like some of the others, but you chose to come home. Liesel nodded, sliding the meatloaf into the oven. 14 of us asked to stay. I was not one of them. I chose to return to find my family, to help rebuild. It was the hardest decision of my life. She had found Dresden in ruins, her family's apartment building damaged but standing. Her mother had survived, though weakened by years of deprivation. Her sister Margaret had married a British soldier and emigrated to England. The city Liesel had known no longer existed, replaced by something scarred and struggling but determined to heal. What Corporal Miller taught me with his meatloaf was this: abundance is not evil, kindness to enemies is not weakness, and the measure of a civilization is not its military power, but how it treats those who have no power to resist. She had returned to Germany carrying these lessons, along with recipes written on scraps of paper and memories of American guards who had treated her with dignity. She had married Heinrich Fischer, a fellow German who had been held at a different American camp, and shared similar stories of unexpected humanity. Together, they had built a life in the new Germany, the democratic Germany, the Germany allied with its former enemies. Hilda Zimmerman had stayed in America, becoming a citizen and working as a nurse in Massachusetts until her retirement. They corresponded regularly, their letters bridging the Atlantic with memories and updates. Hilda had never married, dedicating her life to caring for others as penance and purpose. Trouty Becker had returned to Berlin and become a translator, helping to facilitate communication between German and American officials during the occupation and Reconstruction. She had carried that dinner roll in her pocket for 3 years before finally letting it go, accepting that she did not need physical objects to remember what those months had taught her. The timer rang. Liesel removed the meatloaf from the oven, its surface glazed and glistening exactly as she remembered. She had been making this recipe for 25 years, serving it to her family every few months as a reminder of where she had been and what she had learned.